Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Edgehill and whereabouts for our series about the English Civil War that we started last year, but we didn't quite resume until now. So this video is not about the Battle of Edgehill in, say, if not in a contextual sense to the campaign. Of course, we'll talk about the tactical engagement, but the whole story is aimed at looking at what was happening in England and whereabouts, once again, from political, strategical, also ideological point of view, which we have already sort of paved the way for in the first episode. I think the series is going to last 3 episodes, and it really depends on what we're going to discuss, because at some point we will make singular videos about each and every battle, such as this one, which isn't very famous, but also, for example, I don't know, about Cromwell's new model army, and also these other ones. You know that I actually made some videos about the English Civil War armies. I started pretty early on, and we have, I think, just to talk more about artillery, cavalry. So having fun. We talk about infantry a lot, which of course is also quite relevant given the pike and shot era context. However, you know that the English Civil War has some important features on its own. There is a very sort of archaic, aristocratic background to the royalist forces in many ways, both militarily and socially, which naturally informed the whole political and cultural clash as well. You see here before the reform of the new model army that we just mentioned, and actually disorganized parliamentary force, which will pay for the lack, in fact, of a more cohesive military system, and a pretty big mess all across the country. You know, for all those who have studied the English Civil War in some depth, how complicated, even just from a strictly territorial point of view, who controlled what at which point, this war really is. But this is also the extent of the properly civil strife within England would pave the way to much of the modern country as we know it. And that really show, as I was saying, just peculiar characteristics. For example, it seems that with all those edges, which were surely not the same, the sole reason, right, for that, but if you look at the English countryside, the pike was abandoned in some ways earlier on. More than else, it's this war, this drive forever war to an extent drags on across the entire country that speeds up certain processes that you could have seen also in Germany during the contemporary 30 Years' War, where the pike was ever less relevant in context. So in England, you see the shot from even older technologies like the caliber, etc., gaining, however, a greater relevance in a system that, however, is not particularly advanced. Again, it's not until Cromwell that you can really see an updated English army since the time of Tudor, since the time of Henry VIII, really mostly, the mid-16th century, compared to continental military developments. We talked about this quite recently. We also made a series about the Armada that highlighted the important naval development of England, at least especially throughout all the Tudor era, but also how much they lagged behind, also for correspondingly obvious reasons, in terms of land forces, military development. That's also a topic we will save for more dedicated videos. But let's really dive into today's subject, which is really very, very fascinating. So first of all, as a civil war, there is this psychological edge that informs strategy, authority. We are in the early phases of the war, and so there is much that is yet to be settled in a broader sense. Like at this point, we are in 1642, the beginning of the fall, and some of the broader political alignments of different participants from both sides were not completely clear until military escalation would have properly tested them, and that's why Edgehill is so important. You have this large-scale clash fought, in fact, at Edgehill in South Warwickshire on October the 23rd. At this pivotal moment, Parliament was resolute in stopping King Charles' march towards London, because this was effectively from the English hinterland, the north mostly, and different strongholds was, of course, Charles' strategic objective really where it was at the end of the day. Recognizing, of course, that the control of the capital would provide an obviously significant benefit, to say the least. Right, London, in many ways, had historically been England, even though, of course, many people coming from elsewhere will say, no, because we are out there too. Yeah, but if you look at different countries in Europe, like hardly, even within Britain, the British archipelago, hardly there is a center, there was a real center, a real capital from very early on in Anglo-Saxon history like London. This war obviously shows that controlling London simply per se was not determinant as such. So again, never think that war is predetermined and that the side that will eventually lose was foolish. There's this rhetoric of the lost cause that paradoxically is actually spent in favor of the defeated, very often not much in favor of the winner. But we will also leave this for some politological reflection down the line. The importance of London, of course, stemmed not only from its political and economical centrality, but also from its symbolic value as the seat of governance. That was what really contested at this point, housing, by the way, key institutions like the Tower of London. It was also a bit the symbol of power and iron-fisted authority and control on the realm, and the Mint, which was also, together with other of these infrastructures, critical for military funding and supply, and so the possibility of carrying the war on. London's control was vital in the broader strategic context, and its resources and population could sustain prolonged resistance. Among the causes of the Civil War, you know that there is this expansion of essentially a middle class that doesn't much oppose spending per se, but claimed sort of more representation in that, as far as instead the king tends to centralize under his authority. Naturally, many other tensions arose from different factors, but for a country like the political direction in war waging is, of course, one of the single most important factors and elements you would fight for, just like in this case, right? And had, of course, the Parliament lost London, it would have been severely undermined in legitimacy, in logistics, because again, London as a big city was able to supply armies, as we've seen, but especially was the center of England, the one that would bestow actual public official power, legitimate power to the controller. And of course, a major defeat at that point, losing London, would have potentially forced a negotiated settlement on royalist terms. The city's dense network of merchants and guilds were truly the linchpin of the Parliament's war effort, as they provided financial backbone for raising troops and procuring arms. I made a video about the trained bands that were this essentially militia system that had somehow found in London its greater development. Initially also like having supported the king, depending on which ones we were discussing, and that would be brutally surpassed by the very much needed professional soldiery that the cruelty of the war would prompt to establish for good. In fact, being a bit at the base of a renewed English power in the second part, especially of modern history. By late 1642, Parliament held firm control over London, the southeast, including Kent, Sussex, and Surrey, and much of East Anglia, regions rich as well in economic resources and Puritan support, so with an ideological opposition to what they saw as tyranny in the vast of this proto-Catholic monarchy incarnated by Charles I. We've seen how in other say, European context, you can control, of course, very developed areas with great sort of ideological alignment, but it really depends also on the scale of your power. Like in France, for example, the Northeast, the more developed parts stood by the Catholic monarchy. There virtually were no Calvinists. We've explained this in the video about the French Wars of Religion. London was so central that it would unavoidably contain some of the most sort of progressive ideas, including, Puritanism, at the end of the day will not actually or fully prevail, also because of its excesses that are incompatible with certain specific forms of power development, at least in a functional way, and that, however, backed the parliamentary effort also in quite instrumental fashion, meaning that many parliamentarians were obviously not extremistic fringe fanatics, but the latter instead are quite useful and can be used as manpower and sort of ideological food, so to say. And so this part of England provided the parliament with a robust base for recruitment and taxation, also in terms of manpower, demographic resources, and so on. To accomplish of course, like the victory over the monarchy, the parliamentary army under the command of the Earl of Essex, Robert Devereux, a veteran of the Dutch wars, with limited field command experience down in the truth, but a prominent noble with political clout, whose appointment reflected Parliament's need for a socially prestigious figure to rally support, even within essentially the feudal hierarchy, gathered near Northampton in September and embarked on a mission to track the king's southward movements, closing to London. So again, this choice will be important because the Earl of Essex had some sort of reverence, as we'll see now, towards the same king. Charles, at this point, really had no significant military background, as you know. He was, however, advised by experienced commanders like Sir Jacob Astley and Lord Lindsay, both seasoned in European warfare, should say continental one, and therefore the monarch was aware of the parliamentary activities. Both sides suffered, in any case, from such poor reconnaissance that the royalists did not discover Essex's proximity until October the 22nd. As we'll see now, the parliamentarians weren't faring any better on this ground. The royalists at this stage controlled much of the north of England, including Yorkshire and Lancashire, the west, notably Cornwall and parts of Devon, and the Midlands, but less urban and financial infrastructure compared to Parliament's holdings, thus famously relying on sort of more rudimentary and obsolete means at some point. During the English Civil War, from the Royalist side, you find even some, bands of clubsmen, right, that kept order locally. Not much, effective, of course, for more conventional open ground warfare. But again, we're also talking the first half of the 17th century in Northern Europe, by the way. The lack of effective scouting reflected the rudimentary state of military intelligence throughout, in fact, most of this year, especially in the English army, with both armies relying heavily on local informants and outdated reports. It's as if Stuart's England had still, especially at this point, remained within a sort of feudal fairy tale world, right? Very romantic and sort of broader English fashion, but definitely also quite primitive and limited as far as these military means were concerned. This often led to strategic miscalculations, a problem compounded by the absence at that time of formalized intelligence networks and the reliance on amateur scouts unfamiliar with systematic reconnaissance. Meanwhile, Essex was still unaware of the nearness of the king's forces and was preparing to advance on Banbury, Oxfordshire, to prevent its capture by the royalists. Banbury was a town critical for its position on major supply routes linking the Midlands to the south, essential for controlling the flow of provisions and reinforcements for an eventual march on London, particularly due to grain and livestock availability that, as you know, is crucial for sustaining armies in the field. By this point, Charles and his army had been traveling for 10 days from Shrewsbury toward London, a march intended to assert royalist dominance and pressure the Parliament into negotiations by nearing to the capital alone. All this naturally was compounded with at least the aim of securing key garrisons to protect royalist supply lines from the north along the way, particularly from strongholds like Chester and York. Upon learning that Essex was just 7 miles away, Charles was positioned at Edgehill, west of Banbury and close to Edgehill, a ridge towering 743 feet above the Warwickshire plain, offering a commanding view of the surrounding area. It's a very peculiar landscape. I inserted some pictures about that too. There isn't much. Like if you search on Wikimedia Commons about pictures of England, they're often sort of low resolution. There is sort of very scanty selection. These places that should be, in theory, if anything, just for the historical ecos, let's say, somehow toured and photographed and whatever. Nevertheless, some of the most advanced areas in Europe, but we have so few pictures. Now, the elevated terrain provided the Royalists, obviously with a defensive tactical advantage. The parliamentarians would have had to attack uphill if they had wanted to dislodge the Royalists, exposing, therefore, the parliamentarians to concentrated fire and cavalry charges, a tactical edge that could disrupt enemy formations and morale, without mentioning that uphill you would have found pikemen ready to receive you, so it's something terrifying. The position also allowed Royalist commanders to monitor enemy movements across the open plain below, crucial for maintaining control over the contested Midlands operationally. The next day, King Charles arrayed his forces, which included approximately 3,000 cavalry, 10,000 infantry, 1,000 dragoons, that, as you know, are basically a mounted infantry at this point, and 20 artillery pieces. A medieval army, if you really look at it, a composition really reflecting the Royalists' reliance on the typical mix of the era professional soldiers and locally raised levies, drawn primarily from the Midland and Northern territories. Again, the size is really contained. It is true that here England is split in two, so if you sum, if anything, the forces of the Royalists and the parliamentarians, we have actually a pretty critical effort for even the first half of 17th century England that is more in line with a broader modern national military effort for the era, right? But as I also made it clear in a recent video a couple of months ago regarding the size exactly of early modern armies compared to the ones of 13th, 14th century Western Europe, you really realize that we're not looking at a dramatic increase or improvement. Actually, here there was a major late medieval crisis still to surpass, and it's not before, in fact, the second half of the 17th century that much of that difference is actually gapped. Essex led a force of about 2,000 cavalry, 12,000 infantry, and 700 dragoons, giving him a slight numerical advantage, especially thanks to infantry, though much of his artillery had not yet arrived, delayed by logistical challenges such as poor roads and limited draft animals, which hampered the mobility of heavy guns in the muddy autumn conditions. This is really a combination 17th century campaigns where weather often dictated operational tempo, particularly in the Parliament's southeast where wet conditions slowed transport. However, Essex in this way had really a limited firepower. If you look at the two armies' compositions, you realize that there is, again, from this northern and southern England side, and again, the Royalist and Parliamentarian one, respectively, like a bit more of cavalry due to the aristocratic feudal background. from the other side, less of that sort of more flamboyant nobiliar ethos, but more infantry organized along some more straightforwardly sort of updated military patterns. However, suffering of some problems of broader military arrangement. As we'll see now, there are very competent leaders among the royalists, and here the parliamentarians still are a bit in an impasse, right? Politically before militarily, and we will understand now better why. As we previously explained, held the higher ground. It has a superior position. These are balanced forces, again, at the higher strategical level, mostly warfare really is. At dawn on Sunday, the 23rd of October, Prince Rupert's cavalry, Rupert of the Palatinate, this guy had an importance, we will see now, experience in Germany, like during the 30 Years' War, was already deployed, right? He was a hell of a cavalier, right, with the royalist infantry forming ranks in the meanwhile, seemingly expecting an uphill attack from the parliamentarian forces that, as we will see now, had neither realized in the moment that the royalists were on Edgehill. Rupert was really a seasoned commander with extensive experience in the 30 Years' War, where he honed his aggressive cavalry tactics under the Swedish model, so to say. So again, they were actually fighting from a different ideological standpoint. But again, what Gustavus Adolphus had done in revitalizing speed and shock brought like an important influence also among the more conservative English aristocrats. In this case, positioning Rupert and his forces to exploit the terrain's potential for especially a rapid, devastating charge downhill, right? The same Rupert had scored some points in that regard at battles like Blotho in 1638, where disciplined cavalry charges had broken enemy lines, a tactic well suited to the open fields of Warwickshire. That battle is important because, as you know, the Palatinate was fighting for the Protestants, so Rupert's experience there was really informed by the Dutch and Swedish military thought and practice that we often described in our videos about, in fact, this late Renaissance warfare, the Battle of Blotho against the Imperial Army. Astonishingly, the Earl of Essex remained unaware of the royalist presence still and was heading to church at 8 a.m. when he received news of the enemy's position, a lapse that underscores the disorganized state of parliamentary intelligence and Essex's leisurely approach to command, which contrasted sharply with the urgency of the situation and reflected his prioritization of, at least, like this, of course, were spiritual duties, but at least over battlefield readiness, among the other things, possibly influenced by his general, again, aristocratic upbringing. So his role as a figurehead in Parliament's southeast stronghold was still leaving of more traditional posture that, in fact, mostly affected his relation towards the king, that he was not so willing to actually attack, which may have actually played a role, in fact, in this general attendism, so to say. As the royalists observed from their elevated position, the parliamentary troops hurriedly organized their formations, losing actually in order in this haste and allowing royalist commanders a clear view of their clumsy arrangements in the meanwhile. This visibility was a critical advantage as well, as it enabled the royalists to anticipate parliamentary movements and adjust their strategy accordingly, a factor that amplified the psychological pressure on Essex's unprepared forces, who were caught off guard and struggled to form cohesive battle lines under scrutiny, a vulnerability exacerbated by their reliance on militia from East Anglia and the southeast in general. Right, so this is not professional soldiery. and it makes a hell of a difference, right? Even relatively outdated or, again, romantic-styled aristocratic forces still fighting with almost medieval tactics could be more performing to a degree than this militiamen fighting with pike and shot tactics. Meanwhile, Prince Rupert repositioned his cavalry to a less steep part of the ridge, more suitable for cavalry operations. We are on the right of the formation, a decision informed by his understanding of terrain's impact on mounted troops, ensuring maximum force during charges by aligning with flatter ground that facilitated speed and cohesion, and also possibly outflanking the enemy position. Of course, a tactic that mirrored Gustavus Adolphus' cavalry deployments in European campaigns and leveraged the open terrain of the Midlands. The Battle of Edgehill commenced with an artillery exchange. These barrages were really common. Artillery was really not a particularly deadly weapon in terms of overall battle casualties, but it could frighten the lines, especially of this unprofessional militiamen, and so weakening their ranks in terms of order and cohesion before the main clash started. Mostly what the tactics of the era worked like. Artillery was also deployed often in the front of the enemy, of the various lines. It could be simply left by the same crewmen and resumed during the battle as the various waves of infantry would go back and forth. And especially, again, if you were to win because of mostly of the infantry's role, you would have regained the artillery regardless of possible damage could be inflicted to it at that point. But it was the best to properly, again, especially from the side of the defenders, like the Royalists in this case, that, as we've seen, also have an advantage in artillery itself to really disorder the advancing enemy. And this is really, really important and critical, because if you especially shatter the first ranks of the enemy formation, all the soldiers following behind have a tougher time maintaining the same, which if it's effective, even when done against professionals, you can imagine against amateurs, right? Despite Essex's limited artillery, the engagement was less one-sided than expected, though. In fact, parliamentary gunners, the ones that were there, skillfully ricocheted shots off the slope. Right? This technique maximized the range and effect of their fewer guns by exploiting the terrain's natural incline, causing disruption among royalist ranks despite their numerical inferiority in cannon. A method also adopted sometimes, also like this was pretty straightforward practice, but of course the Dutch had been theorizing this in their manuals, even though they were, again, less performing, say, with what the Spanish or the Imperials actually already did. Emphasizing precision over volume, especially when you were sort of in an impasse like this one, you were in a condition of tactical inferiority. And remember, again, that mostly like the Protestant side is from the side of the parliamentarians, so those military theories that were mostly just like confessional propaganda rather than actual technically expendable info would mostly come from again, that side, like gunners trained in London's militia system. London, of course, had some among the best artillery availability in the country to begin with, and so there were also more technicians, more people skilled in artillery technology, etc. Both sides incurred minor losses, though. Again, you can also ricochet projectiles if you can. By the way, here it was done in some ways, making, of course, the cannonballs bouncing and smashing people in between. But again, there are few shots. Really, overall, there is very slow rate of fire, and overall, this is mostly trying to cause as much damage as the first guys in the ranks are hit. In fact, ricocheting, as we described it, this was still valid by the time of the Napoleonic Wars. I also made a video about the Napoleonic use of artillery. Was particularly effective because the objective was not actually killing people in the sense of maiming them, like making them explode or whatever by being hit by the cannonball. Rather, making them freaking out by actually having all the time in the world to see the cannonball hitting just ahead of them on the field and gradually bouncing against them and rolling toward them, right? Because if you have time to see that, you will get the hell out of the way and you will create more confusion in the ranks. If, say, the cannonball smashes 12 people in a row behind the first ranks, paradoxically, the first ranks will remain more intact, and that even those dead and maimed people will really not have been such a great loss after all. This continues throughout, again, the Napoleonic Wars as well. Then some shells, like, I don't know if you hit a rock or whatever, but this is just a random, and again, at this point, in artillery technology, firepower was so scarce overall that you couldn't count on artillery to begin with, and not even later down the line. Skirmishers followed, with parliamentary and royalist dragoons exchanging fire to clear musketeers from the flanks. This started to be more intense. This was a standard tactic to secure the battlefield's edges and protect the main formations from enfilading fire, critical for maintaining the integrity of pike and shot formations, especially for Parliament's infantry drawn from the southeast that had, again, to go uphill against this well-positioned enemy host. Besides, as you have probably realized by now, from both sides, there were aristocrats fighting against one another. There are proper knights, also cuirassiers, dragoons, there are pistoliers, etc. And even for the common folk of both ranks, seeing, and also from the parliamentary side that is more republicanly minded, seeing this higher status people fighting with that chivalric bravery and testing one another on horseback, etc., is still a very powerful archetypal symbol. Right there, you can properly test the muscle of the enemy, what's his morale, and from these engagements, whoever emerges victorious tends to have already a higher moral ground that can spread to the rest of the army as well. After these initial clashes, the Earl of Essex seemed immobilized by a profound hesitation to attack the king. There was a very deep traditional meaning for this, as Essex felt a deep allegiance towards the sovereign, right? We have seen in the first video, of course, that more or less the broader monarchist theories across Europe, also including the monarchicidtic ones, and by what were substantiated. Naturally, the Earl of Essex was a powerful nobleman in his own regard, and there was about this clash still a very traditional meaning to this all that would have been reinforced by nobiliar traditionalism. And that really felt like, am I fighting against the guy who has been chosen by God to lead my own people, my own kingdom, myself, right? And is there a solution here? Here, the broader political background enters into play. We don't have all the time in the world to simply discuss it, but it's there. It's there in Essex, and this reluctance of his rooted in the complex loyalties of the feudal world, where many parliamentarians themselves, in fact, like Essex, still viewed Charles as their legitimate monarch, did not prevent the outbreak of civil war, but, if anything, delayed decisive action of sort, undermining parliamentary cohesion and allowing the royalists to seize the initiative, right, playing on this vulnerability of their enemy, particularly in the contested Midlands, where territorial control was fluid and historically, let's say, the local nobility had, as you know, always had some kind of adversity towards London in a broader ideological and anthropological sense. Paradoxically, here it was the king that ousted from London could ride the wave of this anti-centralistic push that, in fact, the parliament at that point would have imposed on the rest of the country, in particular on the aristocracy. And so there was, of course, a much thicker layer of many other cultural, social, political, religious considerations that had sparked the same war that definitely does complicate the same. As we were saying at the beginning, the English Civil War, even from a strategical and operational point of view, is very complex and complicated to tell as a whole story. While Essex hesitated, Prince Rupert showed no such restraint. Right? These were sharp-minded, aggressive, brutal young men who really wanted to not just put into practice the tactics learned in the bigger, more updated military environment of the 30 Years' War, but that really had an extraordinary and nobiliar ethos. These were among the most noble, say, principality of Europe, so to say, and as such, that knightly fury, properly channeled into a wise battle plan, was let loose, right? Rupert's aggressive leadership, shaped by his continental military experience, where decisive action often determined outcomes in fluid cavalry-heavy battles, as they hadn't been seen from quite a while on the battlefields of the Old World. And in fact, once seen by Saint Rupert under the Prince of Orange during his continental campaigns, had been informing a bit also the rest of royalist military mindset. And so a bit like this man from the north and the west had been looking upon, especially with this revitalization of cavalry combat, as quite interesting, especially from their more aristocratic background. It was still very much alive also as far as the regular English forces would have had to field in different military circumstances aside from the Civil War at this time. As if paralyzed by their commanders' moral qualms, the parliamentary army remained largely static, as Rupert and his cavalry position on the royalist right wing charged down the hill. You understand how tactically deleterious it is to grant the initiative to the enemy, and especially if you are the attacker, which reveals, in this sense, like a real paralysis, a real moral weakness. And in pike and shot warfare, by the way, if you have to at least attempt this very arduous task of attacking an enemy force uphill by coordinating the pike and shot, the cavalry, with relatively scarce artillery support, etc. Like, this is just like, I don't know, why are you there in the first place? This was really serious. This is how, of course, the royalists exploited the situation, gaining momentum gradually, regardless of, again, their also numerical inferiority, the fact that to some degree they were also worse supplied than the parliamentarians. So again, the odds are relatively balanced. And as you know, pike and shot warfare is really rudimentary. It's really slow. There isn't much of a bigger action. Even cavalry can do so much, but let's say if you don't break the combo pike and shot, which is the bulk of this broader forces, there is relatively few that can be done. The royalists, however, adhering to Rupert's instructions, really made the most of their potential. For example, they held fire until they were within close range of the enemy. This tactic was designed not much to maximize the psychological and physical impact of their charge by delivering a concentrated volley at point-blank range, a technique that, of course, disrupted enemy formations by combining firepower with shock, leveraging this open terrain, but mostly not losing their own. We've seen how, also in later, more orderly 18th century linear tactics, once you had shot basically the first volley, first of all, you didn't see anything. If you're not in front of you, roughly, you could sort of shoot in the mist of the smoke, knowing more or less where the enemy was. But if anything, in the moment in which your own musketeers were to fire again, to switch ranks, to create that hopefully orderly succession of firing lines, this would actually become ever more disorganized and would have reduced the actual effectiveness of firepower. So there was a sort of golden medium between, say, of course, exploiting the advantage, especially here uphill, of a longer range offered by of useful fire by the gravitational acceleration, and the full might of this orderly volleys at very close range that were really brutal. All right, because being hit by a musket ball close range, it was really a very bloody mess. What is also more interesting in a greater sense is that at Edgehill, that anticipated close quarters combat did not actually occur. I mean, the Royalists had barely closed the gap when the parliamentary infantry led by Sir Faithful Fortescue defected. This betrayal was likely influenced by the same Fortescue's prior Royalist sympathies, which, again, is very political, and the intimidating spectacle, by the way, Rupert's advancing cavalry, combined, as we've seen, with pike resistance and shooting support. And so the Royalists' discipline, formation, and reputation for ferocity, also by these elements that had gained experience in Germany, definitely unnerved the poorly trained parliamentary recruits, many of whom were levies with minimal drill experience from, as we've seen, the southeast of England, and relatively, again, fourth, third estate background. The parliamentary cavalry swiftly turned and fled as well, their retreat exacerbated by the lack of experienced leadership under commanders like Lord Fielding, who had limited battlefield experience compared to Rupert's seasoned expertise, and lacked the authority to rally his troops under pressure, a weakness evident in Parliament's southeastern forces. You really must want to reap the guts of people in front of you, like if you're going to engage in melee, right? It's not something you has to be given for granted. It is true that in warfare, it's really rare to see any circumstance in which an army in general that is for fighting doesn't come to grip with the enemy. Here, obviously, something went wrong, mostly at a political level. Of course, the forces would have actually engaged, especially had they attacked on a better ground. But the whole picture is definitely indicating a very scarce morale, some sort of lack of organization, and will to power that instead was very well displayed by the Royalists over the parliamentarians. So what happens? Essentially the Parliament's army melts away, literally by itself, with unstoppable momentum. Of course, the Royalists immediately seized the occasion, the chance. Prince Rupert's forces pursued the retreating enemy as if hunting a pack of foxes. Also, again, in this sort of picturesque autumn English countryside scenario. And this pursuit was really effective, tactically wise, but it also left the Royalist lines dangerously overextended at a point. A recurring flaw, at least in Rupert's aggressive tactics that prioritize immediate impact over strategic cohesion and general control. Naturally, that was complicated also in the art of war of the time. Pike and shot warfare was much less complicated at a bigger level, like in any other battle. It's mostly a matter of battle lines and who's still fighting or not. Cavalry is deployed on the flanks, and or at least once you have basically lined up some forces, they have to go fighting the guys we have in front of them. There isn't this enormous level of, again, command control, say, command flexibility, etc. Like armies still have to gain that over time. I made some videos about, especially the Prussian Frederick II system and how innovative it was for the time, just a few decades before the Napoleonic Wars, to change a big deal. So again, we're still living, as I often say, even though this is modern history, in the Middle Ages, right? And not even in a negative sense, but still in the sense that the scale of warfare, as we noticed before, even just by the size of the armies, is not that greater. The broader costs and sort of ranks in information is similar to the ones of, again, a few centuries before, right? 200 years before, the Wars of the Roses had yet to be fought. They were still in the 100 Years' War. So this speaks perspectively a lot of what we're really assessing from a military historical point of view here. There are some instances, by the way, in which Prince Rupert really had problems in maintaining discipline post-charge in European battles, because these aristocrats that formed the cavalry ranks are also very cocky, and again, they think they are superior to one another. They're very highly competitive, and they're not the best people you can simply control. This risk, by the way, like in open ground, was always there. It could be dangerous to pursue the enemy without broader cohesion, but at some point, if you had broken them, it was also overall the best case to just pursue them and taking down as many as possible. A parallel collapse, by the way, occurred at the opposite, because this was mostly starting from the right side of the royalist force, the left, one of the parliamentarians. So at the opposite end of the battlefield, you have Lord Wilmot's royalist cavalry, led by, in fact, Henry Wilmot, a capable officer with experience in the Bishop's Wars, where he had commanded cavalry against Scottish forces in the north. We've seen it in the previous episode. Charged and shattered Lord Fielding's cavalry, followed by a third assault led by Royalist Lord Digby. George Digby, a politically influential but less military experienced noble whose enthusiasm at least outstripped his tactical acumen, demonstrating in general the Royalists' dominance, especially in cavalry engagements, due to their superior training, equestrian culture, and general aristocratic leadership, right? And not just because of the experience gained under commanders schooled in European warfare, but just by the fact that they were knights in their own regard and were properly brought up to chop people to pieces on a regular basis as their duty towards the king and the country. Particularly, there are some interesting tactics going on. Pistol-based, not quite clerical tactics anymore, but still something similar to the original columns, adapted for, in fact, more shock charges as a whole. So mixing blade and shot on horseback as well. As we've seen, the melee dimension in mounted warfare was regaining strength. Really stemmed from this, for example, this experience on the Scottish frontier. The Scottish border warfare was notoriously sort of mounted. We talked about this in our videos about mostly Tudor-era English and also Scottish warfare, Stuart at that point era for them. There have been an interesting mix also with the dynastic inheritance of the Tudors of the English kingdom, and so you have again this more equestrian bias from the aristocratic side of the English forces, mostly fights under the royalists. Prince Rupert's cavalry pursued the fleeing parliamentary forces. In theory, Prince Rupert's cavalry, by pursuing the fleeing parliamentary forces, left the royalist infantry potentially vulnerable, right? The absence of cavalry and sort of was important. Like in all this warfare, it wasn't just about pike and shot. Again, the full maximization, say, of tactical potential occurred through the mutual support of all arms, including artillery, by the way. In any case, at let's say half of the parliamentary infantry fled before even engaging in combat, as we've seen, due to low morale and inadequate training among Essex's hastily assembled force. As a consequence, the potential issues deriving from the relatively ad hoc nature of both armies' organization, compounded by the lack of standardized command structures, sort of melted, in this case, the parliamentary troops away before most of the systems could be tested against one another. The remaining parliamentary foot soldiers stood, however, firm, supported still by 2 intact cavalry regiments positioned to the right of the center, and even managed to repel the Royalists in close combat, bolstered by the disciplined resolve of units like Sir John Meldrum's infantry, commanded by a professional soldier with extensive experience in the Dutch and Scottish wars, whose mastery of pike and shot formations honed in the Low Countries enabled his troops to withstand the enemy onslaught through tight coordination and defensive resilience. As nightfall neared and Rupert rejoined the Royalist forces, they withdrew in relatively good order, so a testament to their ability to regroup despite the pursuit's overextension, reflecting the discipline instilled by the commanders like Sir Jacob Astley that had experienced, for example, the battles like Maastricht, ensuring some important leadership under pressure as well. So you really needed that experience to learn how to conduct yourself in such circumstances. The tactical outcome of the Battle of Edgehill is thus indecisive. It is true that most of the parliamentary forces fled, but still by dawn there were some Royalist units standing their ground on the field, and so normally, again, the engagement had to be broken off by the evening, as the darkness fell. Especially, we are again at the end of October, so it's not even just a pleasant experience to be out there. Things start to become dangerous because of all the issues of coordination. And in fact, what happened was also normal. The following day, after spending the night on Edgehill, both armies retreated, because they understood that there couldn't be like a sort of full breakthrough from both sides. The parliamentary forces fell back to Warwick, leaving behind 7 of their guns in the process, a significant loss given their already limited artillery capacity in the campaign, which further weakened their ability to conduct offensive operations. Ceding the Royalists also this material advantage in future engagements in the Midlands, King Charles proceeded to Oxford at this point, a move that secured his base in the Thames Valley, a region obviously critical for its agricultural wealth and proximity to London, providing a stable hub for recruitment and supply, reinforcing Royalist control over central England. The king's withdrawal was hastened by the imminent arrival of fresh parliamentary reinforcements as well from London and southeast, but the Earl of Essex had gained no substantial advantage. Nevertheless, the route to London remained open to Charles, who at this point was the one to hesitate in advancing immediately on the capital, fearing it might alienate the now terrified Londoners. Charles thought that he would have, in this sense, completely lost support, causing further fracture had they simply entered in arms the capital, and he preferred to wait, given that, again, parliamentary forces were shattered enough to seize the initiative at other sort of strategic levels. In fact, at this juncture, the king opted to strengthen his position and secure his rear by capturing Banbury, which fell on October the 27th after a brief Royalist artillery assault, leveraging the mobility of their light field guns, which were easier to maneuver than heavier siege cannon. Obviously, this was possible because, again, they had somehow scored what can be considered an important victory in general, like over parliamentarians. Morally speaking, the enemy forces had substantially withdrawn, and now these centers were easier to seize with relatively few pressure. In this way, Charles was basically securing his supply lines to keep on pressuring London. He also seized Oxford, which surrendered without opposition 2 days later. We are on October the 29th, solidifying the royalist heartland in the very Thames Valley that, as we've seen, was really crucial for everybody involved. Military and administrative power laid in the region. The capacity of, especially of the royalists, to connect over central England with the northern strongholds like York and Chester, at this point passed through the seizure of such centres. The impatient Prince Rupert, who had advocated an immediate as rash advance on London after Edgehill to exploit the parliamentary disarray, was held in check by his uncle, reflecting Charles' cautious strategy to avoid overextending his forces. London could have put up an important resistance, and in that sense, the royalists would have been exposed to a war of attrition that they were not prepared to cope with, especially considering that still London, again, it was very big and was better supplied, etc. Even in the case of siege, it would have been very complicated really to hold such a big bite together. There was also an influence on the king from advisors like Edward Hyde, who prioritized long-term consolidation over risky offensives. As well, he recognized that a failed assault on London could exhaust royal resources, and so essentially squandering the current advantage, emboldening Parliament's southeastern strongholds to also resist further during the rest of the campaign. Meanwhile, the Earl of Essex reached London. We are on November the 8th. He was, of course, aware of the royalist threats to the city, and he bolstered thus London's defenses and morale. Right, a critical move to especially restore the capital's population to maintain its role as the epicenter of parliamentary resistance. Charles' forces had moved south to Reading, Berkshire, 4 days earlier, and on November the 7th, prepared to assault Windsor Castle. From Windsor, Charles aimed to disrupt the supply lines to London via the river. This critical, of course, logistical artery that facilitated the transport of food, ammo, and reinforcements from the north, and capable, in fact, of blockading different resources, now had been seized along the banks by the royalists. This, as you understand, Charles was pretty close to London. He was really tightening the grip around it by encircling it, especially controlling the Thames Valley. However, he still refrained from a full-scale attack when Colonel John Vann, a determined parliamentarian with experience in urban militia organization from his role in London's defences, mounted a defiant defence, supported by well-entrenched fortifications that included earthworks and artillery emplacements designed to withstand prolonged sieges, protecting Parliament's southeastern heartland in the process. Instead, the Royalist army continued south, reaching Colnbrook by November the 11th, positioning themselves to threaten London's western approaches. On November the 12th, Prince Rupert was authorized to attack Brentford, which he captured after a short, fierce battle, showcasing his ability to execute rapid, targeted strikes that disrupted parliamentary supply lines and morale, while also signaling royalist strength to wavering Londoners, a blow to Parliament's control over the region. The following day at Turnham Green, the royalists encountered a formidable parliamentary army bolstered to 24,000 men by the disciplined and determined London trained bands that were at least the best of the city's militia system. We were calling it before. They had some more rigorous training. If anything, they also had better equipment given the greater affluence of the London arsenals. And they were, besides, led by experienced officers like Philip Skippen, yet another veteran of the Netherlands who had served under Sir Horace Vere, making such militiamen, at least because of the size of this force, as you realize, is pretty consistent compared, especially to the force of Edgehill, capable, if anything, by that sheer mass to withstand professional assaults through their mastery of at least about defensive formation, reinforcing the defense of the capital in the process. This was an important strategic step forward, exposing also again the capacity of the Londoners to revive, like a shattered parliamentary military fort. Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon, a key political advisor with no formal military training but a keen understanding of propaganda, tried to persuade King Charles that a royalist assault would prompt many Londoners to defect. Right, a claim rooted in the belief that London's population was divided in its loyalties due to, again, economic grievances as well as religious divisions, particularly among moderate Puritans and merchants chafing under wartime taxes around the capital. However, Charles' army at this point, consisting of only 1,900 men, was ill-equipped and outnumbered 13-1, lacking the supplies and cohesion needed for a sustained engagement. All those attacks had secured different positions, but some troops had been lost, others had been installed as garrisons, and so this overstretching had reduced the capacity to wage, especially at this time in the advanced bad season, to wage war on some sort of greater scale, especially against a well-entrenched opponent. And after intermittent skirmishes, the royalist forces withdrew to Hounslow. From there, Charles could have still skirted London to join royalist supporters in Kent and attack the capital from the southeast, a strategy that might have exploited, again, the Kentish royalist sympathies and disrupted parliamentary control by threatening especially their coastal supply routes, and so basically engulfing the Thames lower course both from the estuary and the valley, challenging the Parliament's hold in the most materially relevant part of the country. However, with, in fact, the season now advanced and success uncertain due to deteriorating weather and stretched supply lines, which risked staining the army without provisions, Charles chose to retreat to Reading, arriving on November the 19th in Loch, and then proceeding to Oxford, which was being transformed at this point into a fortified royalist stronghold. Right, a defensive perimeter was further established with strong royalist garrisons at Wallingford, Abingdon, Banbury, Brill, Farringdon, and Burford, creating really a robust network to protect the king's headquarters and ensure control over the surrounding countryside, critical for securing food and recruits for the new season, while also serving as a buffer against parliamentary incursions from the east that, of course, would have continued even during the bad season in sort of raids and skirmishes that would have occurred anyway, even just considering how close these positions were with one another. As the winter of 1642-43 set in, both sides consolidated their control over their respective regions, with the Royalists securing the Thames Valley, much of the north, and so as we've seen Yorkshire, Lancashire, and Cheshire, and West Cornwall, Devon, and now Oxfordshire, providing a broad but fragmented territorial base rich in rural resources, if anything, but lacking major urban centers, and so their industrial potential, mostly material resources, and the parliamentarians strengthening their hold on London instead, and the surrounding areas, Kent, Sussex, Surrey, as well as East Anglia with Norfolk, Suffolk, and Essex. Regions that were not just richer, but ensured still naval supplies to come in. Also having a dense population for recruitment, triggering thus a strategic stalemate that will notoriously shape the war's early phase, as neither side could really unlock this situation and come to dominate the key heartland of southern England. The following month of 1643 saw intense fighting in the west of England, the Midlands, and the north as well, as both sides vied for control of key ports, fortresses, and recruitment grounds. Allegiance, again, was really split over different provinces, so it's really a bit of a mess. Each region's control would have a broader impact on the war effort. The most notable royalist success was Prince Rupert's dramatic capture of Bristol, where on July the 26th, 1643. This victory secured a major port for the royalists, disrupting parliamentary supply lines in the process. Consider that, of course, what is happening in England is attracting the attention of other countries, as well as the simple interest of mercenaries, foreign arms abroad. So by controlling Bristol's maritime trade networks, you could essentially at this point extend the royalist war machine's support by reaching, especially most of the Western English, let's say, trade income, or resources imports from sea networks. The parliamentary forces achieved a significant victory under Colonel Oliver Cromwell, a rising commander with no prior military experience, but a natural aptitude for cavalry tactics, who crushingly defeated a royalist force through a masterful cavalry maneuver at Gainsborough on July the 30th, showcasing the growing professionalism of parliamentary forces, and or at least the necessity for some kind of stepping up in the parliamentary military organization that up to this point had been mostly putting together what was there without thinking in a bigger strategic fashion through the eyes of a comprehensive military effort and reform. There were adoptions of discipline training regiments understood as necessary to counter royalist cavalry superiority in particular. And this is really interesting because it really shows how England still fought in a medieval fashion up to quite recently in time. And so professionalizing pike and shot forces was a bit the key to reassert that what was otherwise by continental standard that's straightforwardly conventional infantry superiority that was just there from the Renaissance. So if anything, by at least having to worry about cavalry highlighted in England, the poor, definitely poor state of parliamentary militias. This gradual sort of improvement of parliamentary forces bolstered the control over parts of the eastern Midlands, if anything. Overall, the fighting, however, still remained inconclusive, right? We mentioned Cromwell because that was his first exploit, but there is much that have to change. We will see in the next video. Neither side was securing a really decisive advantage to shift the war's balance. King Charles' primary effort to achieve a decisive victory occurred on August the 10th, 1643 at Gloucester. He believed that capturing the city combined with Rupert's success at Bristol could deliver a crippling blow to the parliamentary cause by severing their control over the Severn Valley, a key strategic corridor for controlling Western England, which facilitated communication and supply between parliamentary strongholds in the west and south. Right. So again, it's just like a leopard skin territorial control at this point. The royalists really had the capacity to alienate to this single blow, like the parliamentary control over significant parts of England. Equally, the royalists were fighting to fundamentally secure their position in Bristol, so not having further problems from the west, right? So across the major sort of land mass, controlled hand mass. However, Gloucester's garrison, led by Lieutenant Colonel Edward Massey, that had yet again fought in Flanders, put up a fierce defense, having learned from the very intense siege warfare that we often describe for the 80 Years' War. Defense bolstered by extensive fortifications and civilian support that included women and children repairing defenses under fire. A reflection of the city's unified resistance rooted mostly in its Puritan leanings and therefore supporting the broader Parliament cause. Naturally, there was a lot involved in terms of sort of local autonomies, the fact that, of course, the royalist armies as the parliamentarian ones were not too kind in general, and this was a pretty ward war after all, and any kind of political siding when a population supports, for example, the defense of a city during a siege, they're automatically allowing for the siege being fought. Like, people often have still very deeply seated difficulties in realizing that peoples are directly as fully responsible for anything that happens to them. There is no such thing like a country is run by an elite or a government and the people are just, by doing nothing, they're not responsible for it. They're fully enabling that from happening. So, of course, at the time, this made the difference of being pro or against a certain side. And, of course, against the king in particular, it was considered like the highest treason. And the parliamentarians were not tender, so to say. The crisis spurred the Earl of Essex to march westward from London with 6 regiments of the city's aforementioned trained bands, a force whose discipline and numbers offset his earlier hesitations, demonstrating at this point of the campaign his ability to mobilize significant resources when pressed, especially from the Parliament, in a more decisive fashion, with sort of more, with clearer strategic goals at that point, and political settlement, because naturally now the war had entered a much more cruel phase, made of much more specific and now sort of inappealable decisions. Despite Prince Rupert's efforts to intercept Essex with harassing cavalry raids, obviously aiming to disrupt Essex's march by targeting his supply trains with his large force, and so being sort of more exposed to this kind of ambushes and skirmishes, the Earl reached Gloucester to find the parliamentary forces critically low on supplies, with only 3 barrels of gunpowder remaining. Definitely a dire situation that underscored the garrison's resilience and the strategic importance of timely reinforcement in maintaining parliamentary control over the West. This also showing how, of course, how much coordination had existed between these various communities and how much it was a shared sense of sort of coordinated effort at this point between the two sides. So I would say that for the broader strategic picture, we can't leave it at here because, again, the war is very complicated. Again, I'm trying obviously to simplify a bit for the sake of just this introductory videos, but there is really a lot to the whole war and its consequences. As I was saying at the beginning, we have even an English Civil War playlist, which is even heftier at this point than the US Civil War was one. Again, we made that video about the Scottish invasion of England and the beginning of the English Civil War from 1642 to 1642. We made different videos, especially English Civil War infantry, a broad introduction to the same, and again, the various updates during the war. Also one about its composition, of this same forces, Then we made a video about English Civil War flags, another about dress, and those help, right? So again, we need to talk about artillery, we need to talk about cavalry, and then we need to talk about the war in and of itself. So gradually we will expand on this. I always feel sort of bad for not talking more sort of English warfare. I've tried to, especially as modern warfare is concerned, doing it a bit more often. But I see here that we have 50 videos on it. So considering from Anglo-Saxon times, of course, it's not too much, but it's also altogether quite extensive, and we're becoming ever better. A consistent part of this, like 10 videos or so, we have already made, like in 6 months. So it's something that we have sort of stepped up, but every once in a while we find stuff. It's just, I think it's overall pretty scattered, and we should talk more frequently about it. Nevertheless, overall, I'm fairly satisfied with how we're going. Again, there is a lot to discuss about other countries, and it feels that even though we surpassed the 2,500 videos mark, there isn't enough, as a matter of fact, that we've done in a broader sense for most actors involved, with most topics that we dealt with. Like in this case, apparently, with many videos, probably more than most channels, even specializing on the same, but still in a way that is not fully cohesive. Of course, we have more about English history in general. I'll tell you how much, because we mostly talk warfare, but there is English history 80 videos. And if you look at this, let's say that we're starting to really cover quite a lot of interesting stuff. Again, for a given century period, we have starting to have pretty consistent amount of content, but we have to step up a little. And I see strange things, such as, for example, yesterday video about Midway. It was actually, a well-made video, right? One of the few videos that I can say I liked in particular, but that was interesting for me as well, and I thought it was well done also with the pictures and everything. Didn't receive many views. Instead, that was meant to be a secondary video telling the truth about the early medieval warhorse and harness, just because I think, and I did it on purpose, of course, I added Longobards, Visigothic, Frankish, Saxon, Scandinavian, Slavic, etc. Received, like, literally boomed. It got over 1,000 views in a day. This can't work, like that. There must be more homogeneity, more understanding about the broader purpose of this all, because we're not looking at some random stuff. We're really trying to make sense of the whole in a more consistent fashion, and if anything, because all the topic intertwine in a way or another. So it's not really as if I made a video about Midway, and this is not connected with, this video about the English Civil War. I also think it's not going to be particularly watched, right? My impression is that people watch my content mostly because they're titillated at the idea of the video, of the topic. And maybe they don't even watch the video. Maybe they like, as if, okay, make more on this, and they don't even listen to the video. It's very common. And the impression is that, in fact, if the expectations are not met regarding properly the topic in and of itself, like it doesn't go further ahead. besides, I'm really improving the quality of my videos, the imagery, everything has become easier over time. And I have plenty of time to make sort of more specialized videos, so to say, and to extend more. So again, all these topics I think are important to be covered. None of them is sort of expandable. Of course, I'm glad if you watch a video a lot, and it's better than nothing, right? But this is really typical of social media anyway, that there's some even when you know the dynamics here, some unpredictability in terms of what is actually going to be watched more, right, than something else. And this is, again, somehow debatable. But we have really, the outcome of this is somehow, it makes you think. Let's put it in this way. And I actually have some pretty substantial amount of good content that we're going to browse, gluing everything together. And admittedly, everything has become easier over time, but we really must step up because there's been a gradual increase, but it may be also that in summer there's never been such a particularly high amount of views. And so I hope very much that in September, October will escalate in some way as a really, that's the more, preferential, time of the year for spikes in views, etc. And we'll see if I have really lots of videos at this point, very well sort of already prepared. It's again, I've been in advance at some point in preparation, not of the video, but let's say at least the basic, say the pictures, the wall sketches, and so on. And so we are over 70. I know, let's say, what is going to be produced in advance that much, looking at our daily schedule. I perhaps also start to create some reserves, I already have some shorter videos that I can easily record, like not shorts, but almost. If anything, I'll try also to record bit by bit, maybe some entire videos as a whole, depending on the urgency. All right. In any case, for today, I stop it here. This idea of further reserves for more strategic upload. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.